Terrific. Good afternoon again, everybody. I'm also very much looking forward to this session. I do think the referendum presents us really with an invitation to the banking industry to think about the products and services that are offered and the way that they are offered to Indigenous Australians. We know that there are still significant gaps, and we need to think as an industry what is our role in helping to fill those gaps on the areas that are core business to banks. To help me answer some of those questions, as you heard, we have Kirsty Moore. Kirsty is the CEO of Indigenous Business Australia. This is an Australian government agency that has existed, I think, Kirsty, for about 30 years.
Yep.
As its name suggests, its primary function is to support Indigenous businesses, to facilitate and grow and nurture them. But less known is that they also write home loans for Indigenous Australians. We also have Bronwyn Dodd with us. Bronwyn is a Nganangiri woman from South Australia. She is also Westpac's General Manager for Indigenous Business. And we are very pleased to be joined by Mick Gooda. Mick will be known to many of you. Mick, the very best kind of person. He's a Queenslander. He's a Gangaloo man from central Queensland. He is also a former Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner. He's a former Royal Commissioner. He's currently co-chairing the Treaty Advancement Committee in Queensland. And he is also a member of CBA's Indigenous Advisory Committee. And as recently as yesterday afternoon, Mick was in Emerald in the west of central Queensland. It's no mean feat to get from there to here in time for this. So thank you, Mick. We're very appreciative of you making that trek on our behalf. So I'm going to start, Kirsty, with you, and I thought maybe you could set the scene for us. Give us an idea of what are the rates of home ownership for First Australians. IBA as an organisation, of course, exists to close that gap or to be part of closing that gap. But I think helpful for us and the audience to know the size and shape of it.
Sure, thank you for the question. So Indigenous Business Australia has been established purely to advance the economic circumstances of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people nationally. And we do that through three key streams of product. We do supported business loans, we do supported home loans, and we offer investment opportunities. And that's to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across the country. Our home loans book is of particular interest and accounts for $1.5 billion of our $2 billion balance sheet. So the name is perhaps slightly a misnomer. We've been specifically established to recognise the fact that our First Nations people have different needs when it comes to home ownership and need different supports to get into that home ownership journey. And to give you some of the context of the opportunity as I see it, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people own 41% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people own their own home. And that's according to the 2021 census data. That compares to 67% of non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So there is a difference. I don't like to call it a gap, but there is a difference between the 41 and the 67. And conversely, 55% of First Nations people rent, compared to 30% of non-First Nations people. And IBA's role is to target those people that are renting, quite simply, and get them into home ownership. We do that through supported finance. And by support, I mean we make sure that when our customers embark on that home ownership journey, they're ready for that journey. They understand the requirements of home ownership, they understand the needs of household budgeting, and ultimately they will be successful. Because we know that by putting a family into a successful home ownership journey, that will have ripple effects on their community. It will be a role model for other family members who will then follow suit and do the same. Because one of the significant issues we see is a lack of role model, a lack of family examples, and a lack of intergenerational wealth. The bank of mum and dad doesn't exist for our customers to help them move along on that journey. And just to give you a bit of an idea of the scale of what we're looking at, the 2021 census estimated that there were just over 800,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia. We feel that number's perhaps understated. We think it's perhaps closer to 1 million people that potentially could be served if we can look at how we offer these banking products to First Nations people in a way that will ensure success and longevity in their home ownership or business ownership journeys.
Thank you. And I understand that because you've now had about 25 years of dealing with working with these customers and supporting them, my understanding is that the default rate in your mortgage book is similar to or less than the default rate that you would see in a mortgage book for any of the institutions here.
Yeah, so I mean, the Indigenous home ownership program that we run, it's the longest running program in the Aboriginal Affairs portfolio. And we've actually been running it for nearly 50 years in different guises. IBA, though, you're right, as an entity has been there for 20-ish years. While our customers might struggle from time to time, and the level of arrears at any point in time might be slightly higher than what mainstream banks would be used to, the actual rate of mortgagee in possession is below 0.5%. So we work with our customers. If they struggle, we walk hand in hand with them. We will make sure that we keep them in that home ownership journey. So we've got very low levels of loss, despite the fact that we do lend to those that might not otherwise be viewed as, a sensible risk for a mainstream bank.
Mick, it'd be good to hear some of your reflections on the reasons for, whether we call it a gap or a difference, and on the flip side, what you think it might mean for the country if we could close that gap, that difference.
As you know, Anna, we started this process in Queensland about 3 weeks ago. The Queensland Parliament, 88 to 92, voted for the Path to Treaty and truth-telling legislation. So that's a big thing. And part of truth-telling is understanding that. When Kirsty talks about the low rate of home ownership, it's not that we're lazy or don't work. It's there's 2 guys here in Sydney. I lived here for 7 years when I was in the Human Rights Commission, and you'll run across them, Alan and Charles Madden. They do Welcome to Country. Now they moved to Redfern back in the day, as did a lot of people, Aboriginal people, migrants and women. Redfern was this really bustling place of activism and everything, but they got award wages. So they bought houses in the 60s. I talked to them about it down here, and I think they're down at Zetlin around there. And now you can imagine how much they're worth now. So they've got this intergenerational wealth. But my parents and grandparents in Queensland lived on Woorabinda, the mission, and the government took 80% of their wages and stuck it in a welfare fund, and they lost it. You did a lot of work trying to pay that back when you were Premier. So my parents and a lot of our generation didn't have that wherewithal that Alan and Charles had to buy houses. So we missed out. And I think this is part of truth-telling, that we've got to say that. Otherwise, I think we were just these lazy people who relied on welfare. And Ron and I were talking before we come here. We don't want any charity from people in banks. We don't want your charity. If you come to me offering charity, I'll tell you to get lost. But we want to be treated the same, and we want to be given the same opportunities that suit our circumstances. So I think it's really important. And I think when you talk about close the gap, the minute the AFL back in the day were leading the world in racism in sport, and it was Ross Oakley was the CEO, and we had coaches like Nick Malthouse and Terry Wallace. They said, we're not going to have anyone in our teams who were racist on the field. We had a massive overrepresentation of Aboriginal players in the AFL, something like about 14-15%. And I often wonder, if we took racism out of the education system, what would the result be? And I think we'd see similar results. If we took racism out of the employment sector, what would the results be? So I look, when you're saying what does it look like, I think once we fix those things, once we get through this process of truth-telling, I think we'll be well on the way to close that gap.
Thank you. An interesting perspective, and particularly in this year. Thank you, Mick. Bronwyn, nice segue to you, I think. You're working right now in a bank in these sorts of, in looking at these issues and these customers. How does Westpac think about that, and how do you think about it? How do you think about the kind of opportunity that's there?
Yeah, I've returned to the industry 9 months ago, and the investment for our people and the education is beyond what I ever dreamed of. 7 years ago in the industry, it was, not even a topic. Whilst we're in a very strong political environment right now, and it's raised it, it is actually giving us the opportunity to be part of it. So Westpac absolutely are doing the truth-telling, they're listening, they're wanting to understand with genuine interest. I feel the industry is as well. We don't need to do it as an individual bank. We need the industry to do it together, and I can really see that. As a First Nations person, as Mick just said, we're not here to ask to be different. We want to be equal. The purpose that I've driven in Westpac is to make sure First Nations people are financially inclusive. There is that much data and insights to say that we're not, and whether we own a home or not, there's so many other things. I think what the industry needs to do is understand who we are. All too often, the KYC is know your customer. We don't know who First Nations people are, in the industry. It's really, really important. You can't create products and services if you don't know who we are, and we don't. It's very clear. That's okay, but we've got to be ready to understand and listen. And we talk about the truth-telling, it can be very, very confronting. As an industry, you will hear things what banks have done, what they haven't done, but the opportunity is now what we do. I look at the opportunity from an industry perspective. 51% of our people are less than 25 years old. So we've got a very, very young population. Imagine if 51% of those people were able to buy a home in the future. They can do that if we understand who they are, how they live, and what the need is. Not by saying, here's a cheaper home loan or here's a different product, because as we've just said, there's many of us in that other proportion who have worked and earned really hard, been very well educated, and there's a small portion, about 480 First Nations people who own a home. That's nearly half of this room. So when you put it into perspective and you have to understand what the opportunities are, they're endless. But you've got to know who we are. And if we don't do that as an industry, we're going to fail continuously. I don't think it's by intent. I think it's just by understanding. It's not about, in this industry, and we were talking before, we quite often talk about what does it generate back, what's the revenue of it. This is not what this is about. This is about making sure that humans are inclusive and that we're all equal. And absolutely First Nations people have been removed from that for lots of different reasons. So I see that as the opportunity, Anna, is know who we are. And then in the service that you are, you can create a service proposition that makes us be successful. We do work really hard. We do pay our home loans. We do have purpose. And I think once the industry knows that, the opportunity is endless for our people.
Mick, I can feel you bursting to say something.
I think it's about, obviously, I do human rights. That's part of it. And we've got this thing called the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. Now, every nation in the UN have endorsed this. And there's a paragraph in the preamble that talks about the right to be different. And it sort of goes, Indigenous peoples are equal to all other peoples, but have a right to be different and to be respected for that. And that's sort of a human right to be different. And I go to places like banks and the bureaucracy and say, how does that work? And I say, well, it reinforces what Bronwyn says. If you're going to do this properly, you're doing banking systems or health systems or education systems, you've got to build a system that copes with difference. It's not the individuals who are different who have to cope with the system. And I think that's a challenge in the banks now. That's what Bronwyn's saying. Get to know us. There's this rising middle class in the Aboriginal world that are going to require different services to people who are at the low end of the socioeconomic scales. I think treating us as different is really, building systems that treat difference rather than people who are different having to cope with it is the first step.
So given what you've just heard, Kirsty,
Yep.
Kirsty, what are your priorities as CEO in relation to the home ownership part of IBA?
So the opportunity is huge. So each month we receive about 1,000 expressions of interest from people who are interested in buying a home loan. And each year we can only deliver 500 home loans. So, 12,000 people interested and 500 home loans. So there's a significant demand for what we're doing, and there's a shortfall in what we can serve. Now, not all of those customers that are interested are in the right position quite yet to buy a home, and there's multiple reasons why they might not embark on their home ownership journey, but there is significant interest, significant demand. We want to partner more with corporate Australia. We are of the view that there's significant benefit as a government agency that we can bring to the entire sector through working collaboratively with the banking sector. We have forged some excellent relationships already, and just 2 years ago we entered into a partnership with Australian Unity and Bank Australia to work together on the delivery of home loans, recognising the role IBA can play and how we can potentially leverage the capital of the banking sector, but also work collaboratively to ensure that we're providing customer support in an appropriate way. So I think if we can continue to explore what that could look like into the future, what role we can play with corporate Australia, I think that would certainly lead to much bigger supply of outcomes to those that are interested. The other goal that we've got as an organisation is to transition as many customers as possible to mainstream banking as soon as possible. Government shouldn't be intervening in the banking system to the extent it's not necessary. So if we can transition customers to you, the mainstream banks, as soon as possible, they can develop that relationship with you. You can get to understand them. You can see them repaying their home loans. And that can lead to a broader suite of banking services for them than might otherwise be the case. So we're really actively interested in discharge and how we can discharge those customers that are ready to move across and do that in a supported way. So last year, we were able to discharge 13% of our book to mainstream lenders. Obviously, many of whom took advantage of ultra-low interest rates. So we're quite cognizant at the moment of the fact that some might want to come back. And in this rising interest rate environment that we are in, we do not want to see people falling out of home ownership. So we're also keen to explore what role we could have in that space too. So how could we potentially help keep people in that home ownership arrangement in the current environment, and maybe they moved at a point when rates were low, and maybe now they're struggling and maybe don't have the supports in place and the wraparound services that IBA would otherwise bring. So that's probably a hot topic for us at the moment. We want to keep people and families in a home, and I think the priority for this year will be to work out what role we can play in that. But just to go back to what Bronwyn was saying though, a key challenge some of our banking colleagues have said to me is they don't know who their First Nations customers are. They don't want to flag them in the system. They don't know. So how can we work out how to help if we don't know who needs our help, and when IBA could step in and potentially provide some sort of support? So that's probably the challenge, I think, for the banking sector, is how to kind of move forwards in terms of understanding who your customer base is and who the different cohorts are, and particularly your First Nations customers, so that you can design products and services that suit their needs.
Thanks. And I should say that Kirsty's come to us at the ABA, and we're doing a piece of work looking at exactly some of these things. I'm sure that they'd be very happy to talk to any bank that wanted to talk to them directly, but we are looking at trying to have a more coordinated response or ability to respond to the sorts of challenges that we're hearing. Mick, I think we've got a map up here now, and I think you were talking, Mick, about the right to be different. One of the things that is different for many First Nations Australians is that they live on or have some rights to land that is native title land in one form or another in different places. So you might, if you could just maybe tell us a little bit about what this map is telling us, and perhaps, kind of explore some of the challenges for First Nations Australians who are living on and looking to get a home loan on land that is covered by native title.
Can I take that in a different direction?
Sure.
That question. I think you've got to understand home loans are about individuals and families, same as business loans, you give business loans out. But when we talk about economic community development, we're talking about development on this land that you're seeing there. And Tim Wilson, he was a Human Rights Commissioner when I was at the Commission. He and I started a project around the Indigenous estate. We're the classic thing of asset-rich, cash-poor. We control in one way or another about 55% of the Australian landmass. However, because of the systems we have, native title is one of them. You can't mortgage native title. Northern Territory Land Rights Act, there's about a bit higher percentage of that in the Northern Territory that's controlled by Aboriginal people. It's generally inalienable freehold title that comes with land rights in the Northern Territory. You can't mortgage that. In New South Wales, we have a Land Rights Act that people get freehold, but what we find in New South Wales is the government generally give it the freehold and then turn it into a lot of, around Sydney particularly, the green corridors, so you can't mortgage that. So what we've got, and Tim and I talked with the banking industry about how do we actually use that big asset base that we have, combining the restrictions that's placed on it by the sort of tenure you have. And I can tell you there's about 60 different sorts of tenure across Australia, only one of which is freehold that you can go and mortgage, that we've got to deal with, and we've talked a bit about, the risk banks take, they've got to wear the risk, but there's native title people out there like who have fairly big settlements of when they receive native title or in the Northern Territory land rights, who are saying we want to talk to banks about sharing that risk. We'll talk to banks, but we never get to have those conversations. Like, we're not one-trick ponies that we're just sort of there looking for handouts. There are people who want to, if we can develop that land and create jobs, I think it's the most important thing that we've got to have is jobs for our people. And Stradbroke Island, Manduraba, they actually, native title 10 years ago, they're now employing about nearly 200 Quandamooka people who weren't working. The upshot of that is they basically wiped out crime on Stradbroke Island. If you go to the Tower of Power, we call it, and you get to the top floor, you can see Stradbroke, and we're going through all this youth justice stuff. And I said to these ministers, over there on that island is the biggest justice program, the most effective justice program we have. And they said, oh, geez, what courses they run? I said, no, they give people jobs. It's as simple as that. This is how simple it gets. So all of the stuff we talked about, jobs, people with good houses, own homes, have more employment. People with their homeowners have better health outcomes, have better education. We don't have to do research to know that. We just know it from what's happened before. So with this big land mass, we can't use it. And I think that's one of the challenges we need to talk about in the banking industry. How can we do that? How can we actually, this time next week, I will know whether our Gungaloo people have got native title. The determination comes down next Thursday morning. If we get it, we're going to be in the market because there's lots of, out our way, lots of coal mines, and we want to make sure Gungaloo people are part of that economy. And so this time next week I could be cheering or sitting in a pub crying if we don't get it, but that's what it means to us. So we want to use our land base to take us forward like everyone else in Australia does.
And this is something that we recently discussed at the ABA Council, which is our governing body and is made up of the CEOs of 15 of Australia's largest retail banks. And this issue is one we've expressly considered, and the CEOs have said that they want the ABA to do work on this issue. So it's going to be an interesting challenge for us at a policy level, but banks actually have a lot of people in them, who are very smart, who have got lots of opportunity to think about this differently. So I think, we'll be starting with some of the legal people and challenging them to think about how could we think about this differently, and certainly be working with others to do that.
I think the panel before the last one talked about consultation. I think what that lady said was
clarity,
common ground, compromise.
And if you can't find common ground, find compromise.
And we've got to compromise. Banks going to have to compromise a bit. We're going to have to compromise a bit. But I'm sure we can get there.
Well, that's a good, hopeful sentiment, Mick. Bronwyn, you've just come back from Canada and the US with some of your colleagues from Westpac. So maybe you could talk to us a little bit about the way that you're seeing those jurisdictions approach the challenge of lending on First Nations titled land.
Yeah, and I certainly don't need to reiterate what Mick's just said, but that's exactly what Canada do. Very, very interesting. And let me be really clear, we're not comparing apples with apples. So in this industry, we always go, oh, if they're doing it, we can do it. It is extremely complex, so I don't want to mislead people there. They do have a significant amount of treaty there, which creates a whole different thing. So I won't get into that either. But what the banks do, and I met with probably what let's call them their big four, is they absolutely provide flexibility to First Nations people in terms of policy. And we just heard, around the SARA and the regulators and what they need to do. We as an industry need to think different. There is significant change. You need to look at policy. You need to not be we're in Australia, we're very we want to tick the box. That's not how First Nations peoples, and the opportunity that just Mick showed is there. And I think, Canadian First Nations people have been doing it a long, long time. The other thing that was very clear to them is they've got significant support and buy-in from their governments. And, openly, we haven't had that continuously. Our governments can change like theirs do every 4 years, and you and I all know what happens with that. Policy comes and goes. But what was really clear is the consistency in their policy to help First Nations people become owners of their own. They lend on reservations. So, naturally we just don't lend on land. We also have to have the asset there. They do. I spoke to someone, a vice president in the BMO, and he said to me, as a First Nations man who's been in the industry over 30 years, Kirsty just spoke about our default. He knows of one family, and the decision to default that family was based on community. Community elders said this isn't right. We brought in, we helped, we buyed, but we understood that. So I think for the industry, if you begin to understand what the flexibility needs to be, it'll be successful. As Mick said, you give someone a home, you give them purpose, you make them feel like they are worthy and equal, and that gives us our opportunity. We are not coming from wealth. We want to change from poverty to wealth, and First Nations peoples in Canada have done that. Notwithstanding that, they're very, very clear and open to say it's far from perfect. I speak to them around what products and services, and they actually don't have any different to what we do. They have accounts and that, but they understand their customers, so it's inviting. Our people don't feel invited to be part of the industry. It's complex, it's hard, it's not accommodating, it doesn't understand our language or our purpose. I'm not talking language in terms of our cultural language, it's the way we live and how we want to be engaged in a service proposition, and the Canadians do it really well. They're not giving out cheap home loans. They don't have, free things. They have credit policy. If you don't work, you can't get a loan. So again, we don't want to go down that path, because what's going to happen there will be a country that just repossesses every First Nations. That's not what it's about. So it was really, really insightful. And I think, do we need to go copy and paste that? No, because I think that's the risk we do without investigating and ourselves knowing who our people are. All First Nations people, and I say from country to state, whatever it is, we're not all equally the same as every other person here. We're different, we have different needs. So the risk is if we go and adopt all of that, just because it feels easy and it's got some wins, we will fail. So, my hope is that from our industry perspective, we just really deepen our knowledge of what it is, take a bit of risk, and we need everybody to do that. So yeah, it was a wonderful trip, very, very insightful. Yeah.
We are about to run out of time, but I'm going to give you the last word. Mick, when you talk about the Indigenous estate, and I think that map really shows us the size of it, if we were able to do a better job of using that estate for the financial well-being and security of the native title holders, what do you think success would look like?
I think we just join the economy. You know, success is on Stradbroke Island. They're now part of the economy. Getting native title, they're now the biggest landholders. Mind you, 250 years ago they owned everything over there. But they're the biggest landholders over there now. They get a seat at every table talking about development of Stradbroke and their jobs. And they're becoming part of that community. You know, we're always the fringe dwellers out there that you don't have to worry about or you need special programs for. But on Stratty, that's what it looks like. People getting jobs, people participating. I remember coming here when I lived in Redfern. Remember Redfern, the most dangerous place? During the lockdown, Redfern became the safest inner city suburb, and that was because the police went and worked with the community and you know, wiped out 80% of street crime, which was all committed by young Aboriginal men. And when I talked to the police commander, I said, "So how did you do it?" He said, "I just went and talked to all the mob." Funny enough, they want the same thing as everyone. They want their kids to go to school, they want their kids to be safe, they want kids to go and get jobs, and they had some good ideas. So I just talked to them and worked with them. So it's not rocket science. I think it's just maybe the relationship's got to be important. And then that thing about, I'm going to take that home, that consultation thing and talk about it. The middle part is so important, finding the common ground.
Well, I was there at the ceremony when the native title was awarded at on Stradbroke with the Quandamooka people. So it's terrific to hear that 10 years on it's having that impact, and it's a great example that of what might be possible in other parts of the country. And I think there's a lot of appetite in Australia's banks to be tackling this issue in a much more proactive way. So we'll be having this conversation, I think, much more loudly in the year to come.
And I think I get to talk to lots of organisations and you know, there's lots of issues and sometimes they're so big you just walk away. Sometimes I tell people I curl up in the fetal position under the doona because it's so big. But you've got to do what you do. And if you do banking good and you're going to contribute to this country. So I'll challenge you, just do the banking, think about us. Don't think you're going to fix colonisation or health or anything. Just do banking and it'll be okay.
Great advice. Thank you very much. Can I ask you to thank our panel?